Good morning.
Good morning.
So today's Friday. We made it to Friday. Woohoo! I was going to do. I got a Ruby Hero Award for being a Friday Hug superhero this past year, and I was going to do one now, but it sounds like a lot of people are still sleeping. So Johnny asked me to do it later in the day, so I will not be doing a Friday Hug during my talk, unfortunately. So here's Aaron doing a Friday Hug with his cat. I thought there was a game night tonight, so I actually brought these Lord of the Rings cards, which is this co-op card game. It's basically 10 pounds in my suitcase. But then I was told by Aaron that it's only happening yesterday, and I had to practice my talk, so I didn't actually get to play with anyone. But if anyone wants to learn more about it, feel free to come talk to me about it after my talk. So I'm Terence, and I come from Austin, Texas, the taco capital of the nation. And I also found out that we have these really awesome hand cleaning machines. So this is at a local barbecue joint at Rubies. And they're like these hand jacuzzis. You literally just stick your hands in, they wash your hands for you, and they're super clean. And then they also have these awesome stickers after that you can wear, that you can put on. So that's pretty cool. So if you ever come to Austin and I'm actually in town, I will take you to some tacos or to get your hands clean. So it's pretty cool. I also wear a blue hat, if you haven't noticed on Twitter or as I've been walking around. And we formed this Blue Hat League. So here's Chris Kelly from GitHub, and then here's Jessica at Ruby on Rails on Bundler Core. And I also work for Heroku. And like Richard was alluding to, we all have RTFM, basically moniker or acronym. So I'm the Ruby Task Force Manager for the team. And I appreciate Heroku a lot for allowing me to work a bunch on open source and give a lot back to the community. And one of the things that is really amazing is that we sponsor 3 people to work full-time on Ruby and move that project forward. So internally, they're called Matz's Ruby team. And obviously, the leading member of this team is Matz. So he goes and he basically directs that team and manages them and deals with kind of what projects they work on kind of day to day. And they have regular meetings to figure out those kind of things. And there's also Koichi, who basically works full-time on performance improvement to the VM. So if you were around during the 1.8 days, when we moved to 1.9, he worked on Yarv, which is the current VM implementation there. And then more recently in 2.1, he did almost all the Argen GC work as well for that. So thinking about performance in Ruby is something he cares deeply about and spends all of his time at Heroku really working on. And the last person is Nobu, and he basically works full-time on fixing bugs in Ruby, which is pretty awesome. So the fact that Rails has worked with the recent 2.1 release has been a lot of effort on his part, fixing bugs that have been reported. And he has this nickname on the core team called the Patch Monster. So if you actually go and pull the commits in Ruby since 2012, he's up here at the top at 2,000 some commits compared to the second person. There's also this third person is not a human. This is a bot, the SVN bot, and they have 710 commits. And I'll go into a little bit more detail what that bot actually does later on in this talk. And the last person, I do want to highlight the last person here in this talk, zzak, who's the number 5 human committer anyways. I would like to put forth for next year, zzak being nominated for Ruby Hero. And he's been super instrumental in my ability to be effective on the Ruby core team. He's been my mentor and has helped onboard me. He leads the C Ruby documentation stuff and all that front and cares a lot about that. Cares a lot about onboarding people onto C Ruby itself, and also helps a ton with just general open source things. And anytime I need help on anything, he's more than willing to kind of put things down and help me get that stuff done for the betterment of the community. And it's hard to find someone else who cares so deeply about the Ruby community and how it can be successful and should be. So after all that kind of ceremony and stuff, let's get on to the actual talk. So for the agenda, I'm going to go through my story of how I got onto Ruby core and how that came to be. And then the next part will be how you can come and contribute to Ruby. And then the last part I want to end with is some, I guess, like projects and things on my mind of what I would like to do with Ruby and potential things that you guys in the audience or you guys and girls in the audience can help with. So if we rewind all the way back to November of last year, there was this Heap Overflow when you would parse floating points in Ruby. And it was given the CVA identifier 2013-4164. So if you go back through my slides later and you click this link, it'll take you to the news site on Ruby. So to just go through kind of the exploit to see like the impact and how like severe it was. Basically, if you would take any amount of untrusted data and you would convert it to a float, you were potentially vulnerable to this exploit. And like at the surface, this doesn't seem too bad until you realize like if you're doing anything like a Marshall, a JSON, or a YAML, like and you're actually parsing anything that has a float, it's going to call a .2f on it. So if you do JSON.parse, you can imagine like in a Rails app, you can, if you have an API where you're taking a JSON body and it has some user can put a floating point value in, you can be basically exposed to this bug. And if you're not familiar, there's this Metasploit project that basically allows you to test if your app is vulnerable to various known exploits out there. So I pulled a good amount of this code from the Metasploit for the CVE. And basically they had a way to easily construct an evil floating string that then can get parsed by JSON. And then if you just run this locally, you see that your Ruby kind of just segfaults and dies. So if you extrapolate this to like a Rails app where this is particularly common where you're parsing random JSON data, you can imagine a easy denial service where you just construct specially crafted like floating points and crash like a bunch of servers that are running Rails. So it's pretty severe. So when Ruby posted about it, and I looked through the effective versions, I realized it was basically like everything that was running in production. So anything after 1.8.6, so it was like the whole 1.8.7 series, and all these patch levels were basically the recent fixes. So 4.8.4 was released the day of the release, 3.5.3, Preview 2, and obviously the revision trunk. So basically, if you're running any Ruby version, at that point, you were basically vulnerable to this bug. So it was pretty extreme and severe. And as you can see from the exploit, it's not like this theoretical problem. It was pretty practical to be able to exploit this on a Rails server. So it was a pretty big incident. And then they posted the solution of like, this is how you work around this issue, and this is how you fix and patch your Rails app or Ruby app that is running in production out in the wild, exposed to all these script kiddies out there. And one of the things I noticed was like, oh, they only released something for 1.9.3, 2.0.0, and 2.1.0. And I was thinking in my head, like, you know, at Heroku, we have a bunch of people who are still running on 1.8.7 and also running on 1.9.2. Like 1.9.2 was the original Ruby on the Cedar stack when that came out back a few years ago. So what happened to 1.8 and 1.9.2? And so later in that news post, they have this quote that they wrote. Please note that the Ruby 1.8 series, or any earlier releases, are already obsoleted. There's no plan to release new fixed versions for them. So basically, if you're running on 1.8, you were not going to get a patch. It's basically what the news post said. And there was no mention of 1.9.2, even though earlier they said that it was definitely vulnerable. So when I went and inquired people in Japan about like what happened to Ruby 1.9.2, Ayumu sent me this tweet that was Ruby 1.9.2 has dead, and here's this post-it. And this was done at Ruby Kagi last year, and I was actually there, and I don't remember actually seeing this, but I guess this happened, and Yugui, who was the 1.9.2 maintainer, basically says that Ruby 192 is dead. It's nice to meet you 2.0, I believe. No? Okay. Apparently my Japanese is really bad as well. This was all that I found out about Ruby 192, which didn't really give a lot of faith to, I guess, getting fixes or anything. It wasn't really talked about at all in the post. So at Heroku, there was a few issues. Like, we had a bunch of customers on this, and we kind of really just had three options here. We could go and patch all the, we could patch 187 and 192 and kind of just be done with it this one time. We could go in like a step further and actually maintain 187 and 192 and like kind of maintain them for our customers there. Or we could just not do anything and tell customers, you know, Ruby core does not support this stuff. You're kind of on your own here. Like, you know, Ruby's not going to support it. So, and kind of weighing the pros and cons of that, it was actually a pretty tough decision. Like, we spent a long time discussing this internally, like the day of the incident, while people's apps are vulnerable. It was kind of pretty tough. And on the one hand, it's like really crappy to be in this business of forking Rubies and kind of maintaining them that are separate from Ruby core itself. Like, that's not our specialty. That's not the stuff we really work on. But on the flip side, it's, I think, even worse to come out on the day that a vulnerability happens and be like, hey guys, like, we're not going to patch this. You're kind of SOL, right? That's kind of the worst day to tell people you're not going to support something. So we ended up releasing 2 versions of Ruby that were separate from vanilla, like basically not maintained by Ruby core. We went and looked at the fix and tried and backported it and see if it applied cleaning and tested it to see that it actually fixed the vulnerability. And so we took basically the latest release of each of those individual things and incremented the patch level by 1 and applied the fix. So 320 was like the latest in 192 and 374 was the latest in 187. And we kind of just released those. We had a GitHub fork where we had all the work available, and you could go and download the source and they were tagged. And so you could build the Rubies that were running on production in Heroku that we were telling people to use on your machine locally. And then I think at some point down the line, like Ruby build was also supporting the Rubies we were building for these 2 things, because it was a pretty major like vulnerability to have in your app that's like running in the wild. We also notified Ruby core of like us doing this, like, hey, are you guys okay with doing this? Is it okay that we're making up patch levels now, like that are not part of Ruby? And they're actually like very susceptible to this, and we wanted to kind of help commit these things upstream. So if other people were wanted to use this as a base for working on your other 192 forks or other things, or just wanted to build stuff, like they didn't have to go to this special Heroku fork, and they could just use the stuff that was upstream. So after a bunch of talking, it was suggested that I should join Ruby core to help maintain these versions of Ruby. And so zzak actually was the person who sponsored me, and he was the first one on thread and be like, yeah, Terence should be a committer on Ruby. And so he kind of walked me through the process of how you actually do that. So the most important person you have to send this email to is Matz, because he's kind of the final person that says, yes, you get commitment, or no, you don't. And then you basically construct an email that says, I would like to work on I would like commit because I want to work on this stuff, and for my case it was maintaining 187 and 192. And these are examples of like some of the patches, or these are things I've done in the past to actually like commit, so you can see like the work I've done. And then you basically get an email from like various people in the core team, whether they're like pro or minus you actually getting commit bit, or if they have any doubts, and then Matz basically says yes or no. So lucky for me, I got on Ruby core, and so zzak tweeted to all of his followers about this, and then together we drafted a statement about extending the maintenance of 187 and 192. And the thought process behind this is like, if I'm going to do this for Heroku, there's no point in kind of just like doing it separate. Like, you might as well open it up to the rest of the community, so people who are still using 187 and 192 can also benefit, like even if they're not using the platform, right? So one of the restrictions of the maintenance was that we weren't allowed to release. We were only allowed to push to the actual repos and the actual branches on Subversion. So we couldn't actually cut a new P321 release, for instance, for 192. You still would have to go and build that yourself. But luckily, tools like Ruby Build and all those things out there for downloading and installing multiple Rubies has made it much easier to go and install Rubies. Yes.
So you're not actually pushing a tarball out when you do security updates?
No, we don't. We don't have the ability to. We're not allowed to actually do that. Aaron asked if we were allowed to push tarballs for the updates that we do, and we were told that we're not actually allowed to actually do releases. We're only allowed to commit upstream, basically. So we're responsible for the actual release branches, but we can't actually release final tarballs that are ready to be built and stuff. So a lot of people use Ruby Build. At Heroku, I use autoconf and make basically to build stuff. So kind of pick your tool of choice. And so there's other ways to actually get on Ruby core. You can send enough patches where Ruby core gets tired of basically putting your patches into core. So then they give you commit bit. You can work on non-POSIX platforms. So a good example of this is doing Windows work. It's probably a really good project to work on with onboarding and a lot of people who are new to Ruby actually using Windows and making that experience good and performance. So if you're interested in that, I would highly encourage getting involved. Or you can write your own library, and if it happens to get brought into standard lib, you kind of get stuck being on Ruby core. So I think the most recent example of this that I can remember is probably Ruby Gems. I know Eric Hole has done a bunch of other stuff as well, but a good amount of his work is also maintaining Ruby Gems on Ruby itself. And this is much less common nowadays. So I think we're trying to not increase the scope and size of standard library, and potentially there's the discussion of gemification and whatnot. And especially with Ruby Gems in the state that it is now and how easy it is to build gems, I don't think there is as much of a need to kind of bring libraries back into standard lib. So this path is not as widely, I've not seen as many people get into core for the third bullet. Or you could do what I did and do security backporting basically, and then you get on core for maintaining old legacy versions of Ruby. And this is also your friendly reminder to upgrade your version of Ruby. So how many people in the room are still on 1.8.7? Wow, no one. That's pretty awesome. 1.9.2? 2 kind of people. It's weak handshake. Okay. Guess you kind of have Ruby 1.9.2 maybe. So we're ending from the announcement, we're ending support of that in June 2014, so that's in a few months. So would recommend getting off of that if you're still on that. People on 1.9.3, it's definitely a good amount of people. So actually bug fixes for Ruby 1.9.3 ended in February. So we're now actually only in a security only fix period. And that ends in February of next year, which is not actually too far off. So if you're on any of these versions of Ruby, I would highly recommend taking the time in the somewhat near future to move off of it, unless you want to do your own security maintenance for your version of Ruby, which is, I can speak from personal experience, is not very fun. So I would highly recommend not doing that. Okay, so let's talk about how you guys and girls can get involved with Ruby itself. So the first thing you'll want to do is kind of get the source code. So if you don't know, Ruby is on Subversion. So the recommended way is to use Subversion, and you can check out Trunk, which is, if you're not familiar with Subversion, I had to definitely take a refresher kind of course and remember how to use Subversion when I got commit bit and was working with this stuff. But Trunk is basically the equivalent of master if you're familiar with Git, and it's where all the current active development is. So Ruby 2.2 is the next release that's coming out this Christmas, I believe, and all that active development is happening in Trunk. And if you talk to a lot of the Ruby core developers who actually do feature development, they really only talk about Trunk. I know Aaron basically uses Trunk locally when developing, and like basically most people on Ruby core just talk about stuff in trunk. And you can also, so this is what I do, like you can use Subversion branches to basically check out specific release branches here. I actually went down this git svn path. And if you do choose to go down this path, make sure you have like allotted time to actually clone it. So when this happened in November for me, it took me 4 days to clone the whole repo. Yeah, I think there's faster way, and I was talking to Charlie, but they did not respond in time when I was asking for that. So the nice thing is that if you actually like you lose network connectivity or you stop, you can just run like git svn, I believe Rubies, and it will just continue going. So you don't have to do it in like one shot, but it definitely does take a while for a large project like Ruby. And there was some other stuff I learned that I didn't know beforehand. So I wasn't actually familiar with what these patch levels were in Ruby, and I didn't learn until I actually was committing to Ruby. And you have to increment, there's this version.h file that has the patch level, and you basically increment it for every commit that you add to the Ruby source code, and you have to do this by hand. And I also learned the hard way that all the dates are done in JST. So in my first patch, I did not conform to that, and zzak actually gave me this Vim function if you use Vim for just giving you a date, the current date in JST. And so on my first commit to Ruby, I got this nice commit message from the SVN bot. So this is the bot that has 710 commits to Ruby. And it basically goes through and is like, hey, you didn't give the right date. I will fix that for you and do a new commit. So the first time I committed to Ruby, I definitely was not aware of like these things, but thankfully they have a bot like on the maintain release branches that go through and fix your date bugs for you. And so the next thing you'll want to do now that you have the source code is obviously as Rubyist is run your tests, right? And so one of the things that they recommend is to not build Ruby inside your checkout of the source code because it generates a ton of artifacts. If you want to clean and stuff and get kind of messy, especially if you're using Subversion. So highly recommend creating like a separate directory, going through and then building it. And with configure, you can set like a prefix where it'll get installed. And then you also need to link to any kind of libraries that are not kind of linked standardly. And so if you're using Homebrew, like potentially you'll have to link to a separate OpenSSL, readline, zlib, libyaml, libffi, like any of those things, any of those dependencies that are out there. And then you can kind of run all your tests. So Ruby's, the nice thing is that Ruby's tests are all done in Ruby. So this is actually just a shim over test unit, and they actually have a run Ruby interpreter that goes through and runs like the code, then executes with the compiled Ruby that you have. And if you pass the -v option, it's the verbose mode, so it'll give you warnings and stuff. And similar to test unit, you can also just specify individual like paths or like a path of tests that you want to run or an individual test file itself. So you don't have to run necessarily the whole test suite if you just want to test a specific thing. And since the issue tracker that we're using is Redmine and there isn't as much stuff, like at least for big feature development that happens on GitHub, you need to actually create a patch. So you can run svn diff and create this patch that you can then attach to this Redmine bug report we'll go through later, or feature request. I was talking to zzak this morning and he says that anything that's like a small bug or something, if you submit that as a GitHub pull request against the Ruby project, they'll most likely accept it. Though sometimes what they do is they literally just create the patch and then apply it using svn and then put your name as a comment in the thing attributed to so-and-so inside the comments. But zzak says he actually takes any doc changes through GitHub and he will merge those things in. So if you're doing doc or small things, you can use GitHub, but basically if you're unsure, then you should probably be using Redmine, the issue tracker, to be submitting things. And so a lot of the discussion and stuff happens on the mailing list. So when I joined core, there was 2 mailing lists that I got put on. There's a Ruby CVS one, which is basically every commit that ever happens in Ruby, you get an email about it. And then there's this Ruby core one, which is really interesting if you're actually interested in doing development in Ruby. So basically any issue tracker, ticket that gets open or comment, you get an email about it. And this is basically where all the discussion happens for development and issues inside of Ruby. So if you're interested in following along on a regular basis with that and not just like specific tickets, I totally recommend signing up to this mailing list. If you just click this link and you just put your email address and hit submit form, and you will have access. You'll start getting a ton of emails, as Aaron can probably tell you the amount of emails that are unread in your mailbox from this mailing list. So let's talk about the issue tracker, which is kind of the heart of a lot of the discussion and development in Ruby. So it uses Redmine, which is this Rails something app. I don't actually know what version it's on now. And Shibata actually ported it to run on Heroku now, so they aren't running it on someone's box in their basement somewhere anymore. And well, this was like a recent thing that happened in the last 2 months, I believe. So it was a pretty recent change. And if you haven't been, you get this really pretty Redmine page. And you can kind of click around and see, like, they have a wiki. You can look at all the issues and whatnot. And this is basically where you go to find out like how to commit to Ruby. A lot of times there's a bunch of information there, though it's not the easiest to find, and how to look up information about bugs or actually file issues or requests yourself. And so one of the things to note is that when you file a bug with Ruby on Redmine, that you file them against trunk or the current version of Ruby, because they get fixed on trunk first, and then you have to, once it's actually been patched and committed to trunk, then you can issue a separate request and reference that revision in Subversion and say, hi, I would like to backport this to this branch of Ruby. And that's kind of how that development flow works. And then if you click this link down here, it will take you directly to this form, which allows you to go and submit like a bug or issue request. So under tracker, you can specify whether this is an actual bug, if it's a feature, or kind of miscellaneous stuff. So some of the stuff that I've done recently on here where I've submitted requests have been under miscellaneous, like policy changes or things that aren't really code related. And then you want to give a subject and description. And if you have a bug or something, it's good to basically note like how to reproduce this issue, or if you have a feature, like why this issue is actually important and what your use case is super helpful there. And then the status you probably leave to open. You probably aren't going to change the priority. And if you know who the assignee is, you can assign it directly to that person. You're like, oh, I have a bug in psych or something, like I'm going to assign it directly to Aaron. So then you would know to do that. Or if you know who the release maintainers are for a certain branch, you might like assign that to them. Like, I have this backport request, and like I need to assign this to Narus, or Ruby 187 is terrible, and here's this patch that you need. You can assign that to me. And then in category, there's like different categories of what kind of issue this is, or like where it goes in. So there's something for documentation. There's stuff for like core is like the core classes like hash, array, stuff like that. There's stuff for Ruby gems, and there's basically this really long list there. And then you almost always pick the target of 2.2.0 for anything that's new. And then it's always also super helpful to actually put the Ruby version that you're running. So if it's a bug, they can try to reproduce it and like have a meaningful discussion there. And then here where you actually attach things is basically where you attach that patch that I was talking about before. So if you have a bug and you have a fix or a feature, then you can then just attach the patch file and then have an actual discussion with code. And that's always way more helpful than just writing things. So here's the maintainer list, and this is actually super helpful if you're trying to figure out who to assign stuff to. So it will say who maintains what release branches and who kind of maintains exactly what things in standard lib or what in core itself. And so if you're trying to figure out who to actually assign things to, this is a super helpful list of finding out the exact person who's in charge of that part of the project. And then you can also find out stuff that's not maintained, which is always fun. And so when I was working on like my first bug reports, or I guess like, yeah, issue on Redmine, I spent a lot of time thinking about it, and like I drafted it on Google Docs, and I had this like super long prose of like like these are policy changes that I think we should do. You guys don't actually have to read it. It's kind of just an example of like this long-winded text that I submitted. And when I was talking to Zach, he's like, dude, you should not submit this at all. Like, this is really hard to grok and read. And one of the things you have to realize is not everyone on the team speaks English as their primary language. So writing a long-winded response that you might say do for like a Rails issue, where you're like really trying to describe like what you're running into and all this stuff, can get lost in some ways. So when we were doing like the we were talking about branch maintainer approval and discharge process when I was joining core, and it was one of the things that I wanted to talk about. Instead, I just wrote like a very concise thing and then linked to some other thread that talked about it a little bit more, and then literally just wrote the steps in like kind of this bullet style form instead of talking about everything in depth, in the hopes that it was something that was easy to process and that we could have a discussion after that. So what came out of that was we actually came up with these processes that were put as wiki pages on Redmine of like the actual process now after submitting that issue and going through and talking about it. And then here's a link to the actual, if you go to 9218, you can actually see the actual Redmine issue that I took a screenshot before and see all the steps that happened to get us there. So to me, this was like a successful issue that got accepted, and we wrote up documentation, a process behind it of like how to get that stuff done. So this is an example of a miscellaneous thing that's not a bug or a feature in the issue tracker. And there's this other part of Ruby. So Ruby actually has a security team, and there's this security mailing list. And in order to get on the security mailing list, you have to either be a C Ruby committer, work on other implementations of Ruby like Rubiness or JRuby, maglev, stuff like that. You either need, you can work on basic distributions of Ruby. So like if you're running a Linux distro like Red Hat and you distribute Linux, like you can be on this list. Or if you're a platform that basically hosts a bunch of Ruby apps like Heroku, or I imagine EngineArt or any of these other places that do it, you can also be on the list. So you can send an invite and ask a request to get accepted. And one of the things to keep in mind is when you actually find a security vulnerability, doing responsible disclosure is really important. So not necessarily like putting that out in the public where now all these other apps are vulnerable to this thing and it's widely known, and like core is then scrambling to get something out as soon as possible. Being able to work with that person to get something out in a timely fashion, but also not necessarily put all these other apps at a known risk is super helpful. And when you are sending this email, when you describe the vulnerability, if you put a repro case or a way for basically for release branch maintainers to figure out if their release branch itself is affected, is super helpful. So a lot of my job for maintaining 187 and 192 is going through, and when we get emails like this, actually looking at the requests that come in, and you have to decide, does this affect my version of Ruby that I'm maintaining? And if it does, like, do I want to backport it and then basically commit that upstream? So it's super helpful to make it as easy as possible for those people to do it, to get responses out faster. So basically, as a team, we kind of decide if, when a request comes in, if it actually is a security request, because sometimes there's a dispute of whether that actually is true or not. And then if it is, like, who's going to backport it? Like, is the maintainer of 2.0 going to backport this to 2.0? And usually if like one person does it, it's like much easier to make a case for everyone else to do it. So that's kind of the general process of what happens behind the scenes for the security mailing list. So to talk about like a specific issue that happened recently, I don't know if you remember, there was this post that went to the security mailing list, and then it was, I think, public later, but there was something that came in about how Ruby has insecure OpenSSL, is using insecure OpenSSL ciphers by default. So there was a email that was sent in talking about it, and by default, Ruby just kind of relies on OpenSSL to provide like secure defaults for ciphers that are used by Ruby when using OpenSSL. And you kind of ask the question like, who's responsible for like maintaining that list? Is it Ruby's responsibility? Is it OpenSSL? Like where does that actually lie? And there was a lot of discussion. It was a really long thread. But when it came down to it, I think we all agreed on the list that we're responsible for maintaining the security of the customers of Ruby who basically use the Ruby programming language. And that meant that we now have to maintain this cipher list because OpenSSL is not updating it on necessarily a regular basis. So, and then in addition, like you can't guarantee that people who are running OpenSSL like are necessarily running the latest version of OpenSSL. Like if you're on an older LTS release of Ubuntu, you're probably just stuck with whatever that LTS releases of OpenSSL is out there. So the cipher list might be different. But if Ruby maintains its cipher list, then that doesn't really matter as much. So there was this patch that was committed that basically we're now whitelisting every single possible cipher that is considered good. And we are now responsible for maintaining this list. So if it's ever out of date, we're responsible for changing it. So it's this huge burden that's now put on Ruby to kind of be responsible for it. So we don't really get to, the benefit of having OpenSSL maintained is like other languages like Python and other people who use OpenSSL, like we can kind of share that stuff upstream, but now it's like we're now personally responsible for maintaining this list. But the downside to all this is that the patch is not necessarily backwards compatible. So if you were using a version of some cipher on OpenSSL and we decide to just release this patch because it's more secure, then it might break your app, right? Like it will cause an exception to be raised that wasn't normally raised in the first place. And some people might say that's good because your app isn't secure, but that's not really backwards compatible at all. Like if you just got a patch level Ruby that suddenly broke your app, you probably wouldn't be super happy and you wouldn't want to dig into that and figure out why like that actually happened and it was because of this whole issue and kind of dig into that. So this patch is on trunk, but it hasn't been released. And so it's still a thing with a lot of ongoing work. And we're actually going to be discussing it in 2 weeks in Japan at the next Ruby core developer meeting. So it's definitely an active topic that's still not totally resolved. So when you want to kind of talk about issues in real time with the rest of the core team, and this isn't exclusive to the core team necessarily, like if you want to join in on a developer meeting, the meetings are posted on Redmine, like they have wikis with the agenda. So normally the process is if you want to have a meeting, you draft an agenda of like stuff you want to talk about, because assuming if you want to have a meeting, you have a list of things you actually want to talk about, not just want to meet. And then you need to pick a date. So they don't happen necessarily on a regular basis. So you need to pick like an estimate of like when this date should happen. And then you ask Matz first if he can come. And if he says yes, then you basically send an email to the rest of Ruby core to try to coordinate like who can and cannot come. And so this is an example of an agenda that happened last year. So when I was talking about the branch maintenance policy, I think this was in that agenda, as well as the Semver Ruby version type stuff that was happening. And so just real quickly, I know I've gotten questions about the semantic type versioning system in Ruby. So it's actually just a Ruby versioning system. It's not really semantic versioning, but it tries to follow a lot along the lines of the spirit of it. So when you have major releases like Ruby's birthday or something, you might change the major version, and that you can do kind of at will, and you make no guarantees, obviously, of like backwards compatibility there. And then minor versions happen on basically a yearly basis now. So every Christmas there will be a new minor version that comes out, and then it doesn't guarantee that it itself is API incompatible, though I know Ruby core as a whole has been trying pretty hard to be compatible, so it's not a huge pain to upgrade. And then teeny versions are basically like, so when we saw with 2.10, like 2.11 came out, and so these are the equivalent of the former patch level stuff that would happen in the other releases. So these are bug fixes, or security fixes that come out. So we kind of just rolled them up every 2 to 3 months, all the bug fixes that have happened. get then released. And patch is basically the number of commits since the last minor version. So an example of this is in 2.10, the patch level was 0, but in 2.11, if you actually look at the patch level, it's 76, and it's not 0. So that's what that is. And that's kind of how the Ruby versioning system works. And here's an example of an email that Zach sent for actually this one that's coming in 2 weeks. Basically asking if people can meet, and here's a list for the agenda. And if you have topics that you want to submit, please basically edit the wiki and add them onto it. So one of the big agenda items is this OpenSSL issue that I was just talking about. So it's something that we're trying to work on to basically not break a bunch of apps, but still have that better security. So it's something that we're definitely talking about a lot. So kind of in summary with working with Ruby core, one thing to note is that English is not everyone's primary language. So stick to like things that are simple. Don't use really complicated prose or language there. If you can submit code, the better. Like people on Ruby core can read Ruby, and so that's like generally a pretty good way. So if you have a patch, or if you can provide like a repro case as an attachment, like, or just like paste it in, like that's much better than kind of trying to walk someone through just talking about it. And the other thing to note is that Redmine is highly tied to email on that Ruby core list that I was talking about before. And a lot of people on Ruby core actually just process Redmine via their email. So like whatever you write, like make sure it it's going to look okay in email. So don't like necessarily put a bunch of markdown, because that's not going to be formatted inside someone's email renderer. So those are kind of things that I learned the hard way, and I made a bunch of mistakes along the way, like trying to get stuff upstreamed into Ruby itself. So let's talk about, I guess, like future stuff that I'm interested in working on and would love to see community help and other things to move the community forward. So kind of the high-level goals of stuff that I'm interested in working on is like, I would like a really good trust story. Like, running large applications on Ruby is super important to me, especially working at Heroku. And I think being able to trust that the core language is going to be there for you, and be able to run apps on it, and be able to trust that the language is there is really important. Providing transparency, like I know a lot of people don't follow active Ruby core development, especially not being on core, it being in CE, like. And then there's also like the whole Japanese language barrier for some stuff too. So kind of just trying to provide that transparency is one of the overarching goals that we're trying to work on this year as well. For example, like providing notes for Ruby core meetings that happen and having them in English and being able to distribute them. We did that for one of the meetings last year, and I think it's like immensely helpful to just be able to follow along if you're actually interested in that stuff and find a way to get involved in that process. And then also onboarding, like the Ruby community is an amazing community, and it's like one of the reasons I love, working on this stuff and being part of that community, and basically spending every day like thinking about how can I make Ruby better both on Heroku and like as an ecosystem. And I think it'd be super helpful to get more people involved with the actual language development. Like this is the language that you're using in every day, like to run your applications. So anything we can do to make that process better is definitely on the list of stuff that I'm interested in working on this year. So the first one is I would love to move Ruby from Subversion to Git. This isn't something that's set in stone, but there's a bunch of work that is involved there. And so just like with stuff like Redmine and even like the backporting tools that are in the source code itself, like everything is tied to Subversion like through and through. Like all the tooling there, and there's probably a bunch of other stuff that I don't even know about being a new member on core. And so you don't just like get to wake up and be like, okay, we're gonna flip the switch to Git. Like everyone on Ruby core has been using Subversion for a while, and that's like part of the workflow, and this is how they do development. You don't get just to come in and change how everything works. So the easiest way to do that is to go through and take all the tools that use Subversion and make them compatible with Git. So I'm trying to go through and compile a list of what all these things are and talk to Ruby core and figure out any of the things that I'm missing. And basically, there's going to be a list of stuff, and it's not going to be super pretty work to do, but if we can make them compatible to Git when it comes time to be like, hey, Like we can move to Git now, and it's not going to break your workflow. It's going to be pretty much the exact same. I think you can now have that discussion, and it's not going to be a huge resistance because, I mean, these people use Git too, like a lot of them for stuff. So all the infrastructure stuff that gets deployed to Heroku obviously uses Git, and like they accept pull requests on RubyLang, the news sites, like the doc site, things like that. So people on Ruby core are familiar with Git, but it's just a matter of doing the legwork, I think, to get us there to make that happen. So that's definitely one of the top projects that is a little more scoped out than some of the other stuff. The other one is like having done this work of supporting legacy Rubies, and I know Engineer has done this in the past with 186, and we're super, it's super awesome to have that kind of support. So back to the trust story, I think when you're building large applications, you can't really upgrade your Ruby like every single year to like a new version, like, that there's churn in that, especially with much larger applications that have pretty large code bases. But I think Ruby as a whole is doing a much better job of making that process easier with each release and not trying to introduce a bunch of backward breaking changes. So like the move from 193 to 2.00 was much easier than the move from 187 to 1.9, for instance. So we made a lot of headway there. But I think it's also important to recognize that there's going to be large applications that have a lot of money on the line that are willing to or want support for legacy Rubies for in a period of time. If you look at what Oracle or Sun has done with Java, like having that support with the JDK is super important. So I'm trying to figure out if we can set up like a fund or some kind of nonprofit organization where if companies are interested in actually sponsoring this kind of development, we can like support and pay someone to actually support this stuff for people who are interested in getting that to happen. This is definitely a thing that's really in the air and something I need to talk to Matz about, hopefully in Japan in 2 weeks. Next thing is just improving onboarding material. So taking a lot of the material in this talk, a lot of it's actually on the internet, but it's just like in a bunch of different wikis all over the place and trying to figure out how to use Redmine to find the right information, or if it's in like this other thing on RubyLang's sites. So kind of consolidating that, getting people to go through the onboarding process and like actually getting that feedback to be like, oh, well, you said to do this, but it's actually broken. So if people actually want to get involved in Ruby, I'd be happy to have documentation, get feedback on that, and see what works, what doesn't, and what was helpful. This is something that Zach and I are both super excited about making better so we can get more people actively involved. And kind of to wrap up, this is my story of how I got involved with Ruby core, and I would love to see more faces, and hopefully you learn some stuff on how you can get involved, and I would love to see more people so we can work together to make Ruby better. Thanks.